Deep within the suffocating trenches of the sprawling hive cities, there is only the ceaseless rhythm of slaughter. Men and women drown in the blood of their kin, locked in a bitter civil war that has ground a once proud planetary capital to dust. The sky above is choked with the ash of burning promethium and the desperate, unanswered prayers of the dying. Then a sudden shift in the atmosphere draws every exhausted eye upward. The blackened heavens tear open, scarred by thousands of descending contrails. For a fleeting, tragic heartbeat, the defenders lower their mud-slicked laser guns and weep tears of sudden joy. They believe that salvation has finally arrived. In the vast and bloody annals of the Imperium, salvation announces itself with undeniable fury. When the Adeptus Astartes descend from the void, they ride upon pillars of blinding fire. Their drop pods scream through the atmosphere with a thunderous roar that shatters rock and breaks the resolve of the heretic. Even the punishing arrival of an Imperial Navy relief fleet is heralded by the earth-shattering percussion of macro-cannon bombardments. It is a deafening cacophony of righteous destruction that shakes the very foundations of a besieged world. The wrath of the Emperor is glorious, heavily illuminated, and impossibly loud. But what descends upon this ruined planet brings no thunder. It brings no fire. It brings nothing but an absolute, unnatural quiet. This silence is not a reprieve from the horrors of war. It is a predatory vacuum that swallows the fragile spark of hope whole. The clandestine operations of the Holy Inquisition and the specialized extermination fleets of the Imperial Navy do not seek to inspire awe or terror through grand spectacle. Their terrible purpose is not to conquer, but to erase. As the planetary defenders stare into the ash-choked firmament, their joyous relief sours into profound, paralyzing confusion. The sky is not filled with the holy armored chariots of the Space Marines. Instead, a deluge of massive black macro-munitions blots out the pale sun. These are the harbingers of the Life Eater, void-chilled virus bombs designed to slip through the upper atmosphere in absolute unnatural silence. They fall without the fiery halo of atmospheric re-entry. There is no blazing trail of plasma to illuminate the dark, and no sonic boom to warn the doomed souls below of their impending judgment. They are simply cold, unfeeling specks of oblivion, multiplying against the grey clouds. The soldiers in the mud stand frozen, their blood-stained faces turned toward a doom they cannot yet comprehend. The deafening silence stretches out, turning the sprawling battlefield into a vast, breathless tomb. The heavy air grows impossibly still, waiting for the moment the veil of quiet is finally pierced. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the wind begins to shift as the black rain draws dangerously close. The absolute absence of sound begins to curdle, giving way to a sickening, high-pitched phenomenon that bleeds through the clouds. The absolute void of the upper atmosphere yields to the friction of the troposphere, and the terrible silence is finally broken. A new sound begins to bleed through the Vox channels and across the open air. It is not the thunderous roar of Adeptus Astartes insertion craft, nor the heavy rhythmic drumming of orbital artillery preparing the ground for a grand offensive. Instead, it is a high, keening whistle. It is a thin metallic shriek that cuts through the smoke and the screams of the dying like a scalpel through flesh. To the uninitiated masses, it is merely another terrifying noise in a symphony of war. But to the veteran commanders, the grizzled sergeants, and the war-weary generals huddled in their command bunkers, that singular acoustic signature is the tolling of the ultimate bell. They are men and women who have spent decades bleeding for the Golden Throne, learning to identify the caliber of an incoming shell simply by the displacement of the air. Now, the combat adrenaline that has kept them fighting for months evaporates in a single heartbeat, replaced entirely by a paralyzing terminal dread. They know this sound. It is a legendary weapon of psychological devastation, an echo of the ancient primordial betrayals that burned the surface of Istvan III to ash. It is the unmistakable shriek of descending virus bombs. In the span of a single breath, a profound and absolute despair settles over the High Command. This is the purest horror of the 41st millennium made violently manifest. The Imperium of man has not come to save them from the darkness. It has not even come to conquer them, to reclaim their cities with the blood of martyrs and the treads of battle tanks. It has arrived solely to erase them. There will be no glorious last stands within the ruined cathedrals. There will be no desperate, heroic counterattacks immortalized in the annals of the Administratum. They have been weighed on the grand scales of the Adeptus Terra and found to be entirely without value. To the cold, calculating masters of the Holy Ordos, the billions of souls upon this world are not citizens to be rescued, nor even a workforce to be salvaged. They are merely a margin of error. They are an infected cell in the colossal body of the Emperor's realm, an ugly arithmetic anomaly that requires absolute and immediate sanitation. The sprawling bureaucracy of humanity has stamped out their existence with the stroke of a quill, and now the sky itself screams the verdict. Down in the trenches, soldiers look to their officers for orders that will never come, while the command staff stands frozen in the suffocating realization of their own insignificance. Their eyes slowly turn downward from the whistling sky to the flickering phosphor-green displays of their tactical consoles. They watch the Auspex sweepers spinning in agonizingly slow circles, dreading the impending telemetry. Deep beneath the weeping crust of the doomed world, the terrible truth of those falling shadows was already known. Within the reinforced ferrocrete walls of the planetary command bunkers, the archaic green phosphor of Imperial cogitators bathed the faces of Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests in a sickly emerald light. Their mechanical appendages ceased their frantic communion with the Auspex arrays, freezing in sudden reverent terror. The flickering screens did not register the reassuring algorithmic signatures of standard Departamento Munitorum supply drops or reinforced drop pods. Instead, the scrolling runic data streams bore a terrifying absence of conventional military identification. In their place glowed the high encryption clearance ciphers of the Holy Ordos. It was the digital manifestation of the inquisitorial rosette, an apocalyptic sigil that turned blood to ice within the veins of every living soul in the command center. To behold the mark of the Inquisition in such a manner is to look upon the face of an uncaring God. Their authority is absolute, inescapable, and boundless, a dark mirror to the unfathomable power of the master of mankind himself. This was no mere orbital bombardment or tactical strike intended to turn the tide of a losing war. It was the decree of exterminatus. Through the cold mathematics of that data feed, an entire world had just been legally redefined. It was no longer a sovereign domain of the Imperium of man, but a quarantined graveyard, a realm of the dead awaiting execution. The exterminatus is the Emperor's coldest judgment, a physical manifestation of a holy wrath so complete that it leaves no room for martyrdom or salvation. The silent judges sitting in the void of space had weighed the planet in the balance and found it utterly wanting. As the reality of their condemnation settled over the war room, the fragile veneer of imperial discipline shattered into pure, primal panic. Planetary governors, decorated generals, and hardened staff officers threw themselves at the voxcasters. They screamed into the brass-rimmed microphones, their voices cracking with raw desperation as they begged the orbiting fleet for extraction, for a chance to explain, for the smallest morsel of mercy. Their pleas were broadcast across every available frequency, tearing through the static of the dying world. Yet the heavens offered no reprieve. The only response that filtered back down through the encrypted channels was an automated repeating hymnal of absolution. The mournful, synthesized choir of cherubim servitors droned on endlessly, offering empty spiritual solace to a billion-strong population condemned to burn. A suffocating claustrophobia descended upon the bunker, the crushing weight of a sky that had become a sealed tomb. There was nowhere left to run, no reinforcements to rally, and no fortress deep enough to hide from the judgment of the stars. The tech priests began to chant their final rites to the motive force as the planetary governor collapsed, weeping before a silent pict screen. Above them all, the ordnance continued its relentless descent. The shrieking whistle of the black capsules grew louder, piercing through the bunker ceilings and drowning out the automated hymnals of the orbiting executioners. The sky was falling, carrying the absolute end of all things within its iron bellies. The cursed rain plummeted toward the waiting soil, promising a world-ending devastation that the doomed defenders braced to receive. There is no thunderous crescendo of violence. There is no blinding flash of plasma incinerating the horizon, nor the concussive roar of artillery shells throwing dirt and shattered bodies into the blackened sky. Instead, there is only a sheer, terrifying anticlimax. The vanguard of the orbital bombardment strikes the surface with a chorus of heavy, metallic thuds. They slam into the mud of the trench lines, the rockcrete of the hab blocks, and the steel grating of the thoroughfares. They do not detonate, they merely embed themselves deep into the soil and stone, blunt and immovable. In a ruined trench line of the outer defense perimeter, the sudden silence is absolute. The defending infantry, bracing for atomic annihilation, open their eyes to find themselves entirely untouched. A colossal black monolith, a cylinder of scorched and pitted iron, rests in the churned earth just paces away. It is a monument to an unknown doom, radiating the unnatural freezing chill of its void-hardened descent. A single guardsman slowly steps forward, his laser gun lowered, his breath caught in his throat. He stares down at the smooth, featureless casing of the munition, unable to comprehend the mercy of a dud shell. Yet there is no mercy to be found in the ultimate sanction of the Holy Ordos. The Life-Eater virus requires a delivery system of unparalleled resilience and paradoxical delicacy. The dark architects of the Adeptus Mechanicus designed these monstrous vessels to endure the apocalyptic friction of orbital descent. The dark, thermal dampening casing relies on complex anti-gravitic suspensors, shedding velocity in absolute silence to protect the fragile, catastrophic payload nested within its core. The shell is not built to shatter upon impact, but to survive it intact. It is built to deliver death not through kinetic fury, but through a morbid, precise unfurling. The guardsman freezes as a deep, resonating hum begins to vibrate through the soles of his boots. Along the dark surface of the embedded monolith, intricate and sinister locking mechanisms begin to disengage. Heavily armored seams, invisible only a moment before, shift and separate with the grinding scrape of metal against metal. Warning runes etched deep into the casing suddenly ignite. They do not glow with the righteous red of the Imperial war machine, but with an unholy, sickening yellow and a sickly, luminescent green. It is the pale light of a rotting corpse, casting long, unnatural shadows across the faces of the terrified onlookers. Pressure seals hiss, venting superheated gases into the stagnant air of the trench. The top of the casing unlocks. It begins to peel back, petal by heavy metal petal, opening exactly like a morbid mechanical flower blossoming in the mud. Every soldier and civilian stands paralyzed in the grip of primal terror, witnessing the intricate beauty of their own execution. The interlocking gears click into their final alignment. The heart of the payload is exposed to the dying world, and the collective breath of billions is held in one final, agonizing second of absolute anticipation. The silence of the muddy earth was broken not by the righteous roar of high explosives, but by a sickening, pressurized hiss. The metallic shells fractured along their seams, exhaling a weeping greenish-black mist that spilled across the battlefield like a breached artery. This was no conventional chemical weapon, nor was it a simple gas meant to choke the lungs of the unworthy. This was the Life Eater virus, a hyper-aggressive necrotizing pathogen birthed in the darkest, sealed vaults of the Magos biologists. It was an atrocity written in microscopic code, an engineered plague designed to unmake the very foundation of biological existence. It did not billow upward to disperse in the wind. Instead, the unnatural vapor proved heavier than the stagnant air of the world. It collapsed against the earth, moving with the deliberate, crawling malice of a predatory liquid. The creeping tide sought out the lowest ground, pouring over the lips of trench lines and cascading down into the rusted grates of subterranean basements. Where the cold mathematics of orbital bombardment had brought distant ruin, the creeping mist delivered a wet, intimate terror. At the microscopic level, the horrors of the pathogen were beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. The Life Eater did not wait passively to be inhaled by a gasping victim. It possessed a ravenous engineered hunger that actively sought out any trace of organic matter. The very mud beneath the boots of the soldiers began to hiss and boil, bubbling violently as the microbial life within the soil was instantly devoured and converted into sloughing rot. Patches of tough, localized flora withered in an eye blink, their resilient stalks blackening into foul, dissolving sludge before they could even bend to the earth. Clouds of tiny insects, roused from the dirt by the metallic thud of the drop pods, vanished completely into the greenish-black vapor. They were reduced to microscopic droplets of rendered fat and liquefied protein upon first contact. Nothing of flesh or fiber was spared from this voracious alchemy. The cold decree of planetary execution had transformed the physical ground itself into a churning, dissolving nightmare. The lowest-ranking conscripts, huddled in the deep mud of the frontline trenches, were the first to be enveloped by the heavy, suffocating blanket of doom. Alongside them, the terrified civilians who had sought refuge in the deepest, dampest cellars found their subterranean sanctuaries rapidly filling with the descending, weeping fog. The creeping mist offered no quarter, hungrily latching onto the exposed skin and wide, weeping eyes of anyone trapped within its relentless advance. As the horrific realization of their fate finally pierced the fog of war, utter panic shattered the fragile discipline of the Imperial ranks. Driven by the primal, desperate instinct to preserve their rapidly decaying flesh, trembling hands reached frantically toward the webbing of their standard-issue kits. Complete and utter pandemonium consumes the streets of the doomed world as the emerald fog cascades over the battlements. Discipline, hammered into the minds of the planetary defense forces, and the Imperial Guard, through years of brutal instruction, seizes control of their terrified muscles. They fall back upon their endless drills, trusting in the cold and familiar comfort of Departamento Munitorum protocol. Across the crumbling trenches and the fortified urban sprawl, a desperate struggle for survival begins to unfold. Trembling hands snap standard-issue gas masks over sweat-drenched faces. Rebreathers are hastily twisted into locking rings, securing the heavy purification seals with frantic clicks of cold metal and hardening resin. Massive plasteel bunker doors are slammed shut by desperate squads, the heavy locking mechanisms grinding into place with a deafening finality. For a fleeting, agonizing second, the soldiers of the Imperium dare to believe they are safe. They draw deep, ragged breaths through the thick rubber of their respirators. The panicked sound of their own breathing echoes within the dark confines of their helmets like the desperate prayers of the dying. Their standard-issue survival kit is a marvel of brutal, utilitarian design, built to withstand the harshest battlefields in the galaxy. It is heavily reinforced to filter out lethal radiation, to neutralize corrosive chemical weapons, and to purify the most violently toxic atmospheres the enemies of mankind could ever conjure. Wrapped in layers of flak armor and clutching their tightly gripped laser guns, the terrified infantrymen believe they have cheated death. They believe that their unwavering faith in the God Emperor, combined with the rugged and ancient engineering of their protective gear, will be their ultimate salvation against this creeping green doom. They stand in the shadowed silence of their sealed fortifications, listening to the muffled scrape of the unnatural mist washing against the exterior walls. But the tragedy of their ignorance is profound. The Life-Eater virus is not a chemical weapon. It is not a stagnant, inert poison that can be trapped in a charcoal filter or scrubbed out by a mechanical lung. It is a ravenous, hyper-accelerated organism. It possesses a living, microscopic hunger, and it recognizes absolutely no difference between the living flesh of a loyal soldier and the harvested organic compounds forged into his gear. The horrifying truth dawns upon the trapped defenders as the very air inside their sealed sanctuaries begins to suddenly sour. The hardened armoplast framework of their trusted gas masks remains cruelly intact against the invisible biological assault. However, the organic filtration linings of their breathing tubes bubble with a sickening, unnatural heat, rapidly dissolving into a corrosive sludge. Before their wide and panicked eyes, the tough organic fibers woven into their uniform fatigues rot and hiss, melting away like ash cast into a plasma furnace. Their trusted armor has instantly become a deadly vector, trapping the soldiers within a rapidly rotting cage of liquefying synthetic skin. The hermetic seals, meant to keep the horror at bay, instead press the dissolving ruin of their melting masks directly into their own blistering faces. The fragile illusion of protection is violently torn away, leaving behind only the agonizing realization that they have locked themselves inside their own graves. The loyal soldiers of the Imperium drew their first defiant breaths through standard-issue respirators. They expected the familiar metallic chill of scrubbed oxygen to fill their lungs. Instead, they inhaled their own absolute destruction. The Life-Eater virus is not merely a microscopic pathogen that slips quietly through defensive barriers. It is a predatory organism of engineered, apocalyptic hunger. Inside the armored rebreather units, the standard Munitorum filtration materials consisted of activated organic charcoal, woven fiber meshes, and cultivated bioscrubbers. To the insidious viral weapon, these defensive layers were not obstacles to be bypassed. They were an immediate and bountiful harvest. In a fraction of a microsecond, the viral strain identified the organic carbon within the filters as raw sustenance. It instantly devoured the charcoal and the protective bioscrubbers, multiplying 1,000,000,000-fold within the enclosed casing. The very mechanisms designed to purify the poisoned atmosphere were instantly transformed into hyper-incubators. When the soldiers pulled that fateful breath into their bodies, they did not receive the cold salvation of filtered air. They dragged a densely concentrated, superheated stream of exponentially breeding virus particles directly into their respiratory tracts. The physical sensation of that inhalation defied all mortal comprehension of agony. This was not the desperate, frantic gasping of a drowning man fighting for life. This was not the violent, choking reflex associated with inhaling caustic smoke or chemical gas. It was a sudden, searing consumption from the inside out. The life eater engaged the delicate mucosal tissue of the trachea and the alveoli on an immediate, devastating cellular level. The invisible mist aggressively stripped the atomic bonds of human flesh, turning the autonomic act of breathing into an instantaneous act of self-liquefaction. The tender lining of the throat flash-boiled into a necrotic, weeping slurry before the lungs could even fully expand. As the entire respiratory tract collapsed into a bubbling black rot, the immense heat of hyper-accelerated cellular decay radiated outward. The heavy rubber and reinforced plasteel of the gas masks remained indifferently intact, acting as cruel hermetic traps for the rapidly dissolving skin of the soldiers. Driven by an agonizing primal terror that eclipsed all military discipline, men and women tore violently at their own protective equipment. They ripped the suffocating respirators from their skulls, pulling away agonizing sheets of their own ruined facial tissue in the process. But this desperate, mindless bid for fresh air only invited a vastly greater psychological horror. By tearing away the corrupted masks, they laid themselves completely bare. They exposed their open, bleeding faces directly to the dense, swirling fog of the planetary atmosphere. The thick, viral mist rushed eagerly into their open mouths and flayed nasal cavities, ruthlessly accelerating the biological breakdown of their skulls and upper torsos. They fell blindly to their knees in the churning putrid sludge that used to be their comrades. They were entirely unable to draw enough solid breath to form a scream. Yet, the unfathomable agony of their dissolution soon found a twisted voice. As their vocal cords rapidly dissolved into a bloody, infectious ash, the grotesque, wet tearing of their mass demise was captured by their active, helm-mounted voxcasters. From the isolated agony of the single guardsman, the devastation rapidly scales upward into the macrocosm of planetary defense. The Vox networks and command frequencies of the Astra Militarum are usually a cacophony of defiant discipline. In any standard engagement, these channels buzz with the ceaseless exchange of tactical maneuvers, the sacred litanies of the Ministorum priests, and the frantic transmission of artillery coordinates. Now, that proud martial chorus descends into a wretched symphony of wet, hacking coughs. Across 1,000 fortified command bunkers, veteran officers and highly trained Vox operators collapse violently over their Auspex consoles. Desperate commanders, fighting through the sudden burning agony in their chests, attempt to shout final, defiant orders to their breaking front lines. Instead of authoritative words, they spew torrents of black, necrotic blood across the glowing green glass of their tactical displays. Their own lungs are actively digesting themselves within their ruined rib cages. The very act of panicked screaming only draws more of the hyper-aggressive pathogen deeper into their dissolving respiratory tracts, exponentially accelerating their inevitable doom. There is a cold, calculated reason the holy orders of the Emperor's Inquisition rely so heavily upon this exact operational stage of the Exterminatus protocol. The Life-Eater virus is not merely a weapon of biological annihilation, but a precision instrument of absolute historical erasure. By targeting the respiratory and vocal systems with such terrifying speed, the pathogen guarantees that no organized planetary resistance can ever be mounted. No coherent final words of defiance can be spoken, nor can they be transmitted into the void of space. No recorded legacy, no desperate plea for salvation, and no tragic chronicle of their final moments will ever escape the doomed atmosphere of the condemned world. The utter erasure of an entire civilization's history is unfolding in real time, deliberately orchestrated by the complete and violent collapse of its communication infrastructure. To safely monitor the planetary Vox bands from orbit during these agonizing seconds is to subject oneself to a uniquely terrifying auditory nightmare. It is the harrowing sound of an entire planetary command structure consisting of millions of highly coordinated military minds choking to death simultaneously over an open radio frequency. The heavy brass speakers crackle with the sickening sounds of dissolving internal tissue, the wet bubbling of liquefied lungs, and the final gurgling gasps of seasoned generals and terrified conscripts alike. Soon, even the collective coughing begins to cease entirely, replaced only by the heavy sloshing of ruined organic matter collapsing heavily onto metallic decking. The primary organs have been entirely compromised, and the protective internal barriers of the human form are completely gone. The pathogen has finished its ravenous consumption of the delicate internal structures and now moves to sever the final anatomical bonds of the flesh. With the entire respiratory tract reduced to a stagnant pool of organic sludge, the viral agent systematically turns its attention to the fundamental integrity of the body itself, initiating the total and irreversible breakdown of all cellular cohesion. The silence that fell over the planetary command network was not an absence of noise, but the absolute collapse of sanity. Millions of voices that should have been issuing tactical decrees were instead reduced to the primal, shrieking chorus of the dying human animal. Across the doomed world, every living organic being was now completely colonized by the viral pathogen. This was not the cleansing grace of Promethean fire. There was no heat to cauterize the raw wounds, no blessed smoke to asphyxiate the doomed and offer them the mercy of unconsciousness. This was pure dissolution. It was a cellular betrayal orchestrated by the godlike intellects of the darkest magos biologies, hyper-advanced science applied maliciously to the fragile architecture of mortal flesh. The Life-Eater virus functioned with a horrifying, calculated precision. It targeted the complex proteins and cellular walls that bind living tissue together, severing the microscopic anchors of human anatomy. Yet, by some foul mathematical design of its creators, it left the central nervous system miraculously and agonizingly intact. The victims remained entirely conscious. They possessed full cognitive awareness as their own biology betrayed them. Men and women looked down in absolute terror as their skin lost its fundamental cohesion, sloughing off their shivering musculature like wet parchment, tearing in a terrible wind. Every exposed pain receptor fired simultaneously, overloading the synaptic pathways with a volume of agony that defies mortal comprehension. They felt the precise, sickening moment their own eyeballs began to melt within their ocular cavities, blinding them in a sudden wash of gelatinous ruin. They felt the fundamental unmaking of their physical forms as muscle fibers lost their tensile strength, detaching from the bone in wet, heavy ribbons. internal organs ruptured and liquefied one by one, spilling into the abdominal cavities in a churning soup of instantly digested biomatter. Here was the ultimate triumph of apex bioalchemy over the primitive organism. A viral matrix designed by supreme intellects that had long since transcended the weakness of flesh, now inflicting infinite torment upon creatures that were nothing but flesh. Human brains that were already beginning to dissolve in their own ruined cerebrospinal fluid could only register a blinding, inescapable pain. There was no philosophy left to them in those seconds. There was no faith, no defiance, no emperor to pray to. There was only a shrieking descent into the wet abyss of their own unmaking. They were drowning in themselves, choking on the slurry of their own dissolved respiratory tracts. And as the internal architecture of humanity collapsed into a catastrophic puddle of necrotic fluid, a new terror emerged for the soldiers holding the line. The dissolving meat of the mortal guard and the transhuman demigods alike found no escape from the physical space they occupied. The flesh was failing, reducing to a tidal wash of liquid rot, yet it remained stubbornly confined. The unyielding layers of hardened plasteel, adamantium, and heavy flackweave that had been forged to protect them now served a far darker purpose. For the unshielded masses, the end was a sudden, violent dissolution into the soil. But for the elite warriors of the Imperium and the traitorous legions alike, a far more agonizing fate awaited within their vaunted war gear. The Life-Eater virus possesses a cruel, mechanical purity in its design. It devours only the biological. Plasteel, ceramite, and armorplus remain entirely untouched by the ravenous pathogen. Thus, the legendary protective shells worn by Tempestus Scions, Adeptus Sororitas, and the mighty Adeptus Astartes did not fail them in the traditional sense. Instead, they became pristine, impenetrable monuments to their wearers' agonizing demise. For any warrior bearing even microscopic battle damage, the viral strains easily penetrated compromised atmosphere scrubbers and breached failing environmental seals, letting the horrors of the pathogen take hold inside the very suits designed to keep the hostile galaxy at bay. The warrior did not collapse into a formless puddle upon the blasted earth. They melted alive within an upright, sealed sarcophagus. There was no escape from the ultimate suffocating claustrophobia of a vacuum-sealed helmet as the warrior's own flesh began to liquefy and slide down his throat. Muscles detached from dissolving bones sloughing off in wet, heavy ribbons that gathered in the abdominal plating. A revered suit of Mark VII power armor became a pressurized cauldron. The proud Astartes inside was reduced to a pooling, sloshing mass of biological slurry, filling the ceramite greaves with a macabre soup of ruined organs and liquefied tissue. The machine spirits of these armor suits were violently awakened by the sudden, catastrophic failure of their master's biology. Internal auto-senses and tactical displays filled the visors with blinding arrays of frantic red warning runes. Automated medici systems detected massive systemic trauma and reacted with brutal efficiency. Mechanical injectors desperately pumped combat stims, synthetic painkillers, and heavy coagulants into a wearer that no longer possessed a circulatory system. The armor attempted to heal a warrior that had already become a necrotic fluid. Servo motors locked into place as neural interfaces lost connection with dissolved spinal cords, freezing the heavily armored giants in statuesque poses of absolute agony. They stood like solemn monuments across the dying world, unyielding iron tombs, holding nothing but the soup of a dissolved champion. The airtight seals of the neck joints and gauntlets held fast, preventing the liquid remains from escaping onto the ground. They were perfectly preserved nightmare vessels, trapping the dead inside their own legendary war gear. And yet, the Vox networks built into these airtight coffins remained fully operational. The comms channels of 1,000 doomed squads were left open and broadcasting across the dying atmosphere. As lungs dissolved into frothing bile and vocal cords melted away, the final moments of these armored elites were transmitted outward. The silence of the dead world was soon broken by what the mechanical arrays captured from within those metal shells. To remain trapped within an unyielding shell of ceramite is a nightmare few can endure, but to hear the fate of your brothers over the internal Vox is a torment designed by the darkest powers. The squad communication channels, once a sanctuary of disciplined tactical chatter and fervent prayers to the God Emperor, erupted into a sudden cacophony of absolute terror. These were not the screams of wounded warriors facing the noble strike of a blade or the clean burn of plasma. They were the frantic, pitch-shattering shrieks of men feeling their own biology rebel, the sound of flesh betraying its masters in real time. Mind-shattering panic flooded the closed-circuit networks as every soldier realized simultaneously that their armor had become a tomb of digestion. But human screams require vocal cords, and vocal cords are merely meat. As the virulent liquefaction advanced, the anatomy of terror collapsed upon itself. Throats dissolved into weeping slush. Lungs, desperate for air, filled instantly with a rising tide of black necrotic water. The frenzied shrieks lost their human shape entirely, degrading rapidly into something fundamentally abominable. What was once a chorus of terrified men transitioned into a symphony of wet, bubbling static. Thick, viscous biomatter sloshed violently against the internal microphones of the helmets. It was a choking gurgle, the sound of liquefied organs settling into the sealed neck gorgets and chest plates of their own war gear. The last conscious mind within the squad endured a profound psychological annihilation. They sat paralyzed in the dark, their own nervous system failing, while the comms channel forced them to bear witness to the grisly end of their kin. There are no final words of defiance, no litanies of hatred against the Xenos or the heretic. There is only the wet, heavy slop of your lifelong brothers churning into digesting fluid. It is the ultimate and most profane reduction of humanity. Centuries of imperial martial pride, unyielding faith, and relentless discipline are rendered down to nothing more than the sickening gurgle of rotting biomatter sealed in a metal vault. The sacred human form, forged in the image of the Emperor himself, is mocked and erased in seconds. Through all of this biological erasure, the holy machinery of the armor remained entirely indifferent. The steady mechanical hum of the power plant served as the only backing track to this auditory nightmare, a stoic drone beneath the sickening chorus of bubbling flesh. The machine spirits of the armor continued their duties, regulating temperatures and pumping filtered air into helmets that now contained only sludge and dissolving bone. Yet the true horror of this wet static was not confined to a single squad or a solitary trench line. As the bubbling Vox channels slowly fell dead one by one, the silent armor stood as monuments to a microscopic slaughter. This isolated symphony of dissolving flesh was merely a single note in a much larger, infinitely more devastating composition. The wet static was echoing across every frequency, broadcasting the very same death rattle outward to the horizon. The localized horror of the dying soldiery fades into a planetary chorus of dissolution. Beyond the intimate agony of the trenches, a broader canvas of suffering unfolded across the sprawling hive cities. Across the grand plazas and the labyrinthine macro-habs, billions of citizens are subjected to the ultimate biological unmaking. Panic sweeps through the endless crowds of fleeing civilians, but there is nowhere to run when the very air demands their immediate destruction. Within seconds, the structural integrity of the human form simply ceases to exist on a scale that defies mortal comprehension. Screaming mobs do not fall to the ground, they cascade into it. Skeletons liquefy within dissolving muscles, turning frantic, stampeding masses into sudden collapsing waves of dark water. Where a billion souls stood in desperate flight just moments prior, there is now only a rushing surge of necrotizing matter. The voices of the doomed are extinguished, replaced entirely by the sickening roar of a torrential organic flood. A thick tide of biological sludge begins to wash heavily down the slanted rockcrete streets. Boiling rivers of human remains pour over the edges of ornamental balconies and spill down the vast vertical transit shafts. These macabre waterfalls plunge miles into the abyssal depths of the underhive, carrying the liquefied remnants of entire generations into the dark. The sprawling urban arteries become flooded canals, pumping a black, sloshing venom through the heart of the metropolis. Grand cathedrals of the Imperial cult and towering manufactorums alike act as pristine stone basins for this grotesque deluge. In this horrific crucible, the ultimate equality of the grave is achieved with terrifying efficiency. All earthly distinctions are entirely erased by the ravenous viral strain. The pampered nobility in their gilded, atmospherically sealed spires melt at the exact same moment as the wretched dregs starving in the lowest sumps. Loyalist defenders and heretic invaders lose their bitter divisions, blending seamlessly into the same putrid churning stream. Human and xenos, predator and prey, the holy and the profane are perfectly, brutally unified. The Life-Eater virus does not judge the soul, it merely consumes the flesh, rendering every sentient creature into a homogeneous, flowing black tide of indiscriminate rot. It is a chilling testament to the calculated cruelty of this weapon that the artificial world itself remains entirely untouched. The brutalist Gothic architecture of the hive stands perfectly intact, looming stubbornly over the rushing rivers of the dead. Statues of forgotten imperial saints stare down with blind stone eyes upon thoroughfares that now run deep with the biological soup of billions. Not a single pane of armor glass is shattered by the pathogen, nor a single iron rivet rusted. The majestic city simply stands in absolute unblemished silence, watching its inhabitants turn into a dark, churning ocean that now begins to seep downward, destined to poison the very crust of the world. The rivers of human flesh that flooded the monolithic hive cities were but a prelude to a far greater harvest. The Life-Eater virus does not distinguish between the sentient and the insentient. It is a ravenous hunger that demands the absolute consumption of every living cell upon the globe. As the urban centers overflowed with the liquefied remains of billions, the invisible pathogens swept outward to claim the untamed wilds. The total ecological collapse of the living world was absolute and instantaneous. There was no glorious last stand for the mighty forests of the northern continents. Giant, ancient arboreal titans, which had stood steadfast against the brutal storms of millennia, dissolved into weeping torrents of black sap in mere seconds. Vast, rolling plains of emerald grass melted away into endless fields of foul, necrotic mud. Even the immense planetary oceans were not spared from this merciless contagion. Continental blooms of luminescent algae died and rotted before the next tide could even crest. The majestic deep blue waters were forcefully transformed into a stagnant, poisonous sludge. The entire planet was violently stripped of its biosphere, leaving behind nothing but an unrecognizable corpse. What once was a verdant jewel of the Emperor's domain became a dark, bubbling, gelatinous mire spanning pole to pole. Billions of tons of organic matter broke down simultaneously, generating an unthinkable volume of putrid, expanding gas. The desolate landscape heaved and ruptured under the building internal pressure. Thick, foul-smelling lakes of decay covered the plains, choked the dead forests, and drowned the very bedrock of the subterranean hive bottoms. A sickening sensory symphony dominated the poisoned atmosphere. It was the wet, continuous sound of bursting organic pustules and boiling sludge, echoing like a thick stew left to boil over an open fire. Every rupturing bubble released fresh clouds of highly flammable methane, painting the sky in jaundiced hues of sickly yellow and bruised purple. In any other circumstance, such a repulsive landscape would be celebrated as the ultimate manifestation of the plague god, Nurgle. Yet this catastrophic rot was not born from the nightmare realm of the warp. It was enacted by the clinical dogmatic decree of the Holy Ordos of the Inquisition. It was a mathematical extermination, calculated and deployed by the very defenders of humanity to deny the enemy any quarter. This was the freshly dug graveyard of an entire world, a horrific monument to the terrifying authority of the Imperium. But the planet was not entirely devoid of terrified witnesses. Deep beneath the shifting crust, or sealed within the highest spire vaults, a pitiful fraction of the population remained temporarily untouched by the viral storm. These incredibly few souls were securely trapped within heavily armored environmental bunkers, their ancient hermetic seals desperately holding back the tide of death. They survived the initial infection, only to be trapped in a state of unparalleled psychological torment. Through static-filled pict feeds and trembling auger arrays, they bore witness to the total erasure of their home. They could only watch in mute horror as the world outside their reinforced bulkheads transformed into an endless ocean of boiling, apocalyptic decay, waiting for a salvation that would never come. Above the bubbling oceans of black sludge, a profound silence should have reigned over the ruins of a murdered biosphere. Yet the cruelest absolute of this universe is that some are condemned to survive longer than others. For the Adeptus Astartes, the very apex of humanity, their legendary transhuman biology becomes a theater of ultimate, inescapable torment. The Emperor's divine design, meant to conquer the stars, is entirely mocked by the ravages of the Life-Eater virus. Deep within their ceramite armor, the complex redundancy of the space marine physiology fights a brutal war it has already lost. The multi-lung attempts to filter an environment that is no longer breathable air, but a thick aerosol of aggressive rot. The oolitic kidney labors with frantic futility to flush out ravenous toxins that multiply exponentially, vastly faster than the superhuman heart can pump them away. The Larraman's organ endlessly releases its miraculous cells, desperately trying to clot blood that the viral pathogen has already rendered into a thin, weeping liquid. Even the hyper-resilient preomnous stomach churns in sudden, violent agony, blindly attempting to isolate poisons that are actively digesting the organ walls from the inside out. The gene-forged warriors of the Imperium do not die quickly. Their augmented bodies cruelly force them to endure every agonizing fraction of cellular dissolution, trapping their immense, disciplined minds in a failing cage of rotting flesh. To be a space marine in these final horrific seconds is to experience a depth of terminal despair previously unknown to the angels of death. Far below the ruined surface, deep within subterranean fortresses, another kind of damnation unfolds for mere mortal men. Through the thick viewports of reinforced armor glass, deep bunker survivors bear helpless witness as their world literally melts into a planetary grave. They are separated from the apocalyptic liquefaction by mere meters of plasteel and dense ferrocrete, yet they possess an acute, horrifying awareness of their impending doom. They watch the black sludge swallow the great hive spires, drowning out all light and consuming the bedrock itself. They know with absolute certainty that the heavy atmospheric seals on their blast doors will eventually corrode, buckle and fail under the relentless chemical siege. Even if the mighty bulkheads hold against the impossible tide, the survivors know they are entombed alive upon a dead, rotting sphere. There is no hope of rescue, no distant chance of salvation, and no future save slow starvation in the suffocating dark. It is the purest manifestation of hopeless, terminal despair ever conceived by mortal minds. They are left with nothing but the deafening roar of their own rapid breathing and the muffled, wet sound of their beloved world dissolving just beyond the glass. Yet the nightmare of the virus is not confined solely to the flesh it violently consumes. The staggering, unquantifiable volume of dissolved biological matter suddenly begins to react on a planetary scale. This massive global liquefaction produces an invisible, highly volatile chemical byproduct that steams and rises violently from the churning muck. Vast, invisible clouds of this highly flammable gas ascend into the sky to rapidly alter the entire composition of the planetary atmosphere. The final testament of flesh is not the puddle of weeping ruin left behind, but the vapor that rises from it. From the liquefied remains of champions and cowards alike, a horrific alchemy takes hold across the entire globe. Billions upon billions of tons of dissolved organic matter begin to violently boil. The life-eater virus does not merely melt the planetary biosphere into a necrotic slurry, it forces a rapid, utterly unnatural sublimation of all biological material. The oceans of black rot-off gas with terrifying speed, releasing an endless choking tide of decomposition vapor into the wounded skies. The atmosphere itself becomes the primary actor in this stage of the planetary execution. It swells with alarming ferocity, thickening into a hazy, turbulent miasma that quickly smothers the remaining light of the sun. Winds, born of rapidly shifting atmospheric pressure, howl across the barren, newly stripped bedrock. They tear through the haze in violent, chaotic tempests that carry the foul payload across every continent. This is a planetary exhalation, the collective, dying breath of a murdered world. To stand within this swelling storm is to experience a sensory assault unparalleled in the dark annals of Imperial warfare. The stench is not the foul, sulphurous reek of standard organic decay, but something far more insidious. It is paradoxically, sickeningly sweet. A cloying, heavy aroma of hyper-accelerated rot coats the tongue, slipping into the throat like a sugary poison. It carries the distinct, sharp copper tang of uncounted gallons of dissolved blood, perfectly mingled with the nectar of blooming decay. This is the perfume of the life-eater, a scent so unfathomably dense that it possesses a tangible physical weight. It crushes down upon the surface, increasing the barometric pressure until the very air feels as heavy as an ocean trench. This oppressive, gaseous gravity actually bends the dying rays of sunlight, refracting them unnaturally through the dense particulate matter of shredded cells. Because of this immense displacement, the sky above is painted a bruised, horrific purplish black. It takes on the distinct, mottled color of a strangulation wound rendered on a grand celestial scale. Yet this sickening canopy is not a mere byproduct of the viral slaughter. It is a core, carefully engineered mechanism of the exterminatus sanction itself. This dense, sweet fog is entirely composed of highly concentrated biogenic methane and complex necrotic gases. It is profoundly, violently flammable. The atmosphere is now bloating, swelling uncontrollably like a neglected corpse left to bake beneath a harsh summer sun. The very air has been transformed into a planetary powder keg, awaiting only a single stray spark to fulfill the ultimate fiery judgment of the Emperor. Every pocket of the atmosphere, from the deepest canyons to the highest mountain peaks, is saturated with this explosive potential. The world is pregnant with its own imminent cremation, and beneath this bruised and heavy sky, the final cruelty of the virus reveals itself to those miraculous few who have somehow survived the initial melting. Their fortified transhuman lungs and sealed bunker vents can no longer protect them from the sheer scale of this atmospheric displacement. They are forced to gasp in terror for breath in a world that no longer possesses a single breathable molecule of oxygen. Instead, they draw the thick, sweet mist deep into their burning chests. They are left to consciously suffocate on the aerosolized remains of their own brothers, their own teeming cities, and their own dying world. Deep beneath the dissolving crust of the doomed world, the final bastions of human defiance still clutch at life. Adamantium bulkheads and heavily shielded void doors have successfully repelled the weeping deluge of the liquid virus. The deepest command bunkers, built to withstand the furious orbital bombardment of heretic fleets, remain physically intact. Yet even these impregnable subterranean vaults cannot defy the apocalyptic physics of the Life Eater. Above them, the atmosphere has swollen into an immense, overpressurized envelope of putrefying gas. This unimaginable barometric weight presses down upon the planetary crust, hungering for the slightest weakness. It aggressively overloads the external atmospheric scrubbers, choking the intake valves with hyperconcentrated necrotic matter until the ancient hermetic seals finally corrode and fail. The rot gas does not batter down the void-shielded blast doors. It floods the primary ventilation networks, silent and entirely inevitable. Inside the claustrophobic dark, emergency lumens cast a bloody glow over the absolute last living organisms on the planet. They are not melting into organic sludge like the billions who perished screaming on the surface. They are suffering a far more intimate and agonizing demise. The sweet, heavy gas violently displaces the precious oxygen within the bunkers, sinking to the floors and rising like a suffocating tide. Life support cogitators chime their final frantic warnings before their delicate intakes are corroded into permanent silence. The dying planetary governors, the entrenched generals, and the shivering serfs all claw desperately at their own throats. Their lungs burn with an excruciating fire, instinctively gasping for a salvation that no longer exists in the material realm. When they draw their final, shuddering breaths, they do not find the crisp, purified air of their sanctuaries. They inhale the sickeningly sweet, toxic perfume of their own civilization rendered down to vapor. This is the ultimate macabre horror of the Imperial sanction. The frantic survivors are asphyxiating on the aerosolized remains of their own magnificent world. With every ragged, desperate gasp, they literally breathe in the vaporized, rotting essence of their families, their loyal comrades, and the very flora that once fed them. The claustrophobic air is thick with the biological ghosts of 1 trillion perished lives. Sprawling forests, teeming hive cities, and soaring cathedrals of flesh have all been distilled into this cloying, highly flammable miasma. It is a sensory overload of absolute nightmare. The metallic taste of blood, the overwhelmingly sweet stench of total decay, and the smothering warmth of the gas coat the insides of their throats. They are drowning in the liquefied ghosts of their biosphere. The very populations they sought to outlive are now the direct instrument of their suffocation. Bodies twitch and convulse on the cold metal decking as their brains starve of oxygen, flooded instead with the concentrated death rattle of a murdered planet. Above this hidden subterranean agony, the sky is black and bloated with the atmospheric pressure of total biological collapse. The air is completely unbreathable, a churning storm of volatile biogenic fumes waiting for a single spark. The weeping world has finally ceased its screaming. It now holds its breath, swollen and pregnant with combustible ruin. The stage is perfectly set, steeped in the suffocating silence of total planetary rot. Far above the choking dark, beyond the swollen layers of toxic clouds, the cold and merciless vacuum of the void awaits the final judgment. Far above the rotting sphere, the void offers a profound and merciless silence. The cloying, sweet stench of planetary death does not reach the high orbit of the Inquisition flagship. Here, within the sanctified vaults of the command bridge, there is only the sterile scent of sacred myrrh and the low, rhythmic thrum of ancient plasma reactors. The transition from the surface to the stars is an absolute severing of realities. Below, the world is a wet, hyper-intimate hellscape of mutating biology and choking despair. Above, there is only the cold, unfeeling and clinical arithmetic of Imperial justice. The Lord Inquisitor stands as a motionless statue of judgment before the primary tactical auspex. His gaze is fixed upon the flickering hololithic sphere of the condemned planet. He feels neither triumphant zeal nor crushing sorrow at the slaughter of billions. There is no hatred in his heart, nor is there even a flicker of pity. To the agents of the Holy Ordos, a corrupted world is merely a gangrenous limb on the body of the Imperium. The Inquisitor is the surgeon, and Exterminatus is the scalpel. He watches with absolute emotional detachment as the atmospheric composition readings shift across the display. The swirling, sickly hues of the dying biosphere darken and condense into a bruised, violently heavy red. This represents the precipice of annihilation. The saturation of the planetary atmosphere with hyper-flammable decay gases has reached its precise, optimal threshold. The air of the entire condemned world is now a single swollen lung waiting to breathe fire. The mathematics of absolute destruction are exact and entirely unforgiving. Every variable of pressure and density has been measured by the humming logic engines of the vessel. With a fractional, silent nod from the Inquisitor, the final execution sequence begins. Deep within the heavily armored belly of the warship, the executioner tools awaken. The primary orbital lance batteries are awakened from their slumber. They are terrifying monuments to human wrath, colossal arrays of dark iron and focusing crystals designed specifically to murder worlds. Beside the command throne, a heavily augmented gunnery servitor interfaces with the firing console. Its humanity was long ago erased by the priests of Mars, leaving only a shell of flesh bound to brass and wire. The Lord Inquisitor himself intones the ultimate authorization codes of the Holy Ordos. Each syllable is a death knell, spoken with a cold, absolute certainty that echoes across the silent bridge. The sacred ciphers cascade through the primary cogitators, unlocking the final safety wards. Rune after rune flashes from a passive gold to an angry crimson upon the engagement plinth. The immense burden of total planetary genocide rests upon a singular, unyielding action. The Inquisitor steps forward, the servos of his master-crafted power armor purring softly against the grated deck. His armored hand hovers over the heavy iron engagement stud. He speaks a final, emotionless prayer of absolution to the God Emperor of mankind, committing the souls of the innocent to the golden throne and the souls of the wicked to the void. With the supreme, cold certainty of the Imperial war machine, he depresses the execution stud. From the cold void of absolute detachment, the judgment of the Emperor descends. A single lance of cohesive photon energy pierces the bloated heavens. It is a blinding spear of righteous fury, cast down into an ocean of purplish-black stagnation. Time itself seems to fracture and slow to a frozen crawl in the face of such profound violence. We are suspended in the microscopic eternity of the descent. Down through the wretched stratosphere it falls, a solitary streak of incandescent white, cutting through a world smothered in the thick smog of its own decay. This is not a simple act of burning. The atmosphere of the Doomsphere has been transmuted by heresy and rot into a hyperflammable miasma. Every cubic centimeter of the air is choked with the aerosolized remains of the dead. It is a rich, volatile soup of methane, necrotic gases, and pestilent spores. When the superheated energy of the orbital lance finally touches the upper boundaries of this sweet rot, the physics of annihilation take absolute control. This is the genesis of a planetary-scale atmospheric immolation. The initial kiss of the lance beam does not merely ignite the gas. It agitates the molecular structure of the corruption, breaking the stagnant bonds of decay and preparing the entire atmosphere for instantaneous, catastrophic combustion. In this suspended microsecond, a solitary point of blinding pure light blooms within the dark, suffocating embrace of the plague cloud. It is a single spark of absolute purity surrounded by billions of tons of liquefied sin. The spark takes hold, feeding ravenously upon the very corruption that sought to devour the world. It draws in the foul aerosols, stripping the necrotic flesh from the wind and converting the harvest of the plague god into raw, unbridled thermal energy. The pressure differential in the upper atmosphere drops drastically as all available oxygen is devoured by the growing sphere of plasma. A vacuum forms around the lance strike, pulling more of the combustible rot upward into the maw of the newborn inferno. Tension pulls taut across the fabric of the sky, vibrating with apocalyptic potential. The heat rises exponentially, crossing the threshold of conventional fire and entering the realm of stellar fusion. This is the ultimate alchemy of the Holy Inquisition. The foulness of the traitor, the mutated biomass, and the airborne plagues are reduced to mere fuel for their own eradication. In this infinitesimally small fraction of a second, the spark becomes a localized sun of agonizing perfection. It is a hungry, desperate light that demands absolute consumption. The blinding sphere of heat expands by mere millimeters, yet it holds the kinetic potential to shatter the tectonic plates of the world below. It sits heavily upon the precipice of total planetary immolation. The hyperflammable ocean of gas waits in the terrible silence of this final fraction of a heartbeat. Every malignant spore and breath of corrupted wind is primed to catch the cascading fire. The agonizing weight reaches a terrifying fever pitch as the thermal reaction breaches the critical mass of ignition. In the infinitesimal fraction of a heartbeat that follows the catalyst, the orbital spark blossoms into an apocalyptic revelation. The sky does not merely ignite, it detonates in a singular, omnidirectional cataclysm of unrestrained fury. A hypersonic shockwave of pure thermal annihilation races across the curvature of the doomed world, dragging a blinding wall of roaring flame behind it. There is no dawn or dusk anymore, only a continuous spherical corona of absolute destruction that swallows the horizon in every direction. The very clouds are transformed into a canopy of superheated plasma that descends upon the land like the heavy hand of a vengeful god. The roar of this global ignition is a sound of such unfathomable magnitude that it defies the limits of mortal perception. It is a concussive thunder of atmospheric displacement that would instantly rupture the eardrums and shatter the skulls of any remaining souls cowering in the deepest subterranean bunkers. Yet there is no one left to hear it, only the deafening roar of a world being unmade. The heat strikes the surface with the absolute certainty of divine judgment. In a fraction of a second, the festering oceans of bio-sludge and the sprawling lakes of foul putrefaction flash boil into screaming columns of steam before vanishing into nothingness. Billions of tons of organic corruption are vaporized instantly, their blasphemous mass eradicated by a temperature so intense it perfectly mimics the blinding heart of a newborn star. The planetary firestorm does not merely burn upon the world, it actively incinerates the atmosphere itself. The sickly sweet stench of rot, disease and rampant mutation that had choked this sphere for decades is purged in a singular violent exhalation of fire. In its place comes the sterile, dry heat of an immense planetary crematorium entirely devoid of life or mercy. This hungry inferno aggressively seeks out fuel, plunging into the depths of the earth. It violently rips the oxygen from every cavern, every besieged trench, and every winding tunnel of the enemy warrens. Subterranean networks that thought themselves safe from the orbital bombardment above are instantly choked. The very air within these dark places is ignited and violently drawn out by the vacuum of the surface conflagration, collapsing the lungs of any abomination lurking in the dark. This is no mere weapon of war, but a sacred instrument of ultimate finality. The sheer, awe-inspiring scale of an entire globe burning in perfect unison creates a beacon of righteous devastation in the cold cosmic void. It is a monumental funeral pyre, a celestial manifestation of grief and hatred so impossibly bright that its violent birth flashes across the immaterium. The sudden psychic flare of this dead world echoes violently through the immaterium, sensed by astropaths in neighboring star systems as a stark warning to the enemies of humanity. To look upon this blazing orb is to witness the uncompromising wrath of the master of mankind made manifest in glorious fire. The biosphere is entirely erased. The heavens are scorched to featureless ash, and the howling tempest of plasma mercilessly consumes the very bedrock of the crust. The world is reduced to a barren cinder of its former self, cleansed of all sin. As the fuel of 1 billion tainted lives and countless corrupted ecosystems is finally spent, the raging inferno begins its inevitable wane. The blinding light begins to dim, slowly drawing back the veil to reveal the smouldering corpse of a world where only absolute destruction remains. And then the inferno dies. It does not slowly fade, nor does it gradually wane into embers. It simply ceases to be. In a single, terrifying heartbeat, the ravenous global firestorm consumes the very last atom of combustible fuel, devouring the world's ruined atmosphere in its entirety before starving itself into nothingness. The apocalyptic roar that tore across the continents is instantly extinguished. It is replaced by a profound, suffocating stillness that crashes down upon the world like an anvil. There is no wind to stir the ashes, for there is no air left to breathe or to move. There is no sound, for there is nothing left alive to cry out, and no medium through which a cry could ever travel. The surface of the world has been utterly and violently transformed. The immense, incomprehensible heat of the atmospheric ignition has flash-baked the oceans of decomposing biosludge and the corrupted bedrock of the planet itself. Where once there were sprawling plains of pestilence and teeming billions of infected souls, there is now only a flawless, unbroken shell of smooth, dead black glass. This obsidian mirror wraps the globe in a perfect sphere of absolute, unending desolation. Rising from this polished crust are the skeletal remains of the towering hive cities. Stripped of their armor, their screaming populations, and their festering foulness, they are reduced to nothing but scorched iron husks. These colossal metal spires claw hopelessly at the void above, standing as stark and silent monuments to a civilization completely erased from the annals of history. Across the glassy, hardened surface, the cold, distant light of a billion indifferent stars reflects perfectly, undisturbed by storm, cloud, or vapor. This is the true finality of Exterminatus. This is the ultimate, terrible mercy bestowed by the master of mankind. The flesh-dissolving virus was the herald of agony, a righteous punishment of pain and rot for a populace that turned away from the Emperor's guiding light. But the fire was salvation. The fire brought immediate, absolute purification, burning away the taint of the Xenos, the corruption of the heretic, and the very concept of organic suffering. The fire brought the long, quiet peace of the grave. The planet is fundamentally dead, sterilized far below the tectonic plates, cleansed forever of every sin, every shadow, and every memory. To look upon this silent globe of black glass is to gaze into the true, uncompromising heart of the Imperium. It is a brutal testament to the cold, unyielding detachment required to protect humanity from the encroaching horrors of a hostile galaxy. The Imperium does not mourn the billions lost, for their souls were already forfeit the moment the darkness took root. The Holy Orders do not weep for this burned, nameless world, for its death ensures the continued survival of 1,000 other planets. The executioners merely bear witness to the silence, leave this frozen sphere to the unending night, and turn their mighty warships back toward the stars, forever carrying the Emperor's unforgiving justice into the eternal dark.